Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Beyond Talking Points. I'm Matthew with my co-host Matt, or Matt with my co-host Matthew. Today, we are going to have a general discussion about the concept of the social contract. What is the social contract? What are our opinions of the social contract, for or against? And if we don't have, if we run short on time, we might also tackle a little bit more of something we talked about last episode, which was an debate between Gene Epstein and Richard Wolff on the whether capitalism or socialism is a better system of government. So I guess I'll just jump right in. I was looking. I thought, similar to the anarcho-capitalist episode, we could start with some definitions. So the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, social contract theory, nearly as old as philosophy itself, is the view that persons' moral and or political obligations are dependent upon a contract or agreement among them to form the society in which they live. And then the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy says, the aim of a social contract theory is to show that members of some society have reason to endorse and comply with the fundamental social rules, laws, institutions, and or principles of that society. And there's a lot of times the social contract that we think about today, and the social contract that a lot of liberal or left-leaning people think about, actually wasn't thought about until like the 17th century, I think, with a philosopher named Grotius, because he began the tradition, which is that social contract is between individuals, between the people, because traditionally it had been thought of that the social contract was between an individual and the state. But then people, I think that is actually would be the Hobbesian definition, if I remember correctly. Whereas the John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau were more in line with Grotius. Of course, John Locke famously inspired the American Revolution because he said, if a government doesn't protect life, liberty, and property, then you have the right to break the social contract and form your own government. So I guess I'll just add that and let you jump in here after this. I do approve, or I do believe in such a thing as a social contract, and it really goes back to something Aristotle said. Aristotle famously said that man is a political animal, and by that he meant that man is. Another question that often happens in philosophy is man, is society natural or is it artificial? So are we more about just being on our own and looking after ourselves, or is it more about being in a collective, being in a group? And Aristotle basically said that no, man is meant to be in society, so that society is natural. So he had no patience for the philosophers that thought we need to go back to nature, to a pre-societal time. He said no, society is as natural as human nature itself. And so I think that to begin our conversation, I would say that to have a society means that you have a social contract of some sort.
So I think as a whole, the whole idea of the social contract is pretty interesting, because I think it opens up several lines of dialogue, several modes of interpretation, and I think people run into different, I guess, it might be a little crude for me to say errors in thinking, but people interpret certain things differently. And in my mind, a lot of people get some issues mixed up. So I guess where should I start? One thing that I found consistently when I was listening to various people discuss the idea of a social contract was people at the same time will talk about society and they'll talk about government as if those two things are kind of interchangeable. And in my mind, those things have been in the material I was reviewing, we're getting conflated a lot. Right. So it seems like a lot of people, when they talk about the social contract, have this idea that to have a functioning society, it's kind of like an a priori presupposition that a government is required and that those things are kind of interlinked. I don't think that's necessarily true. And that's where I start to really push back against a lot of what people say here. And to go into that further, one thing that I think is interesting about the word anarchy is people often apply this connotation that anarchy is related to chaos, right? And that's why you see like a lot of people who consider themselves anarchists run around and they're breaking things and they're rioting. But in my mind, I don't necessarily think anarchy and chaos have to be like these factors that go together in all cases. I think anarchy is just people going about doing things as they please. You're interacting with others freely, but that doesn't mean you can use violence on other people, right? So a lot of rules that our society acts upon aren't necessarily followed because the government enforces them. They're followed because there are consequences. And right now in our world, the government's the one who usually, is the person who's enforcing and, paying out these consequences to people, right? But that doesn't mean that the government's the only thing that could do that, right? So imagine there was no government, but somebody came and killed my brother. Well, if you imagine honor cultures and somebody from like one tribe gets killed by another tribe, you go and you get vengeance, right? So one person gets killed, well, you go and you enforce that. You pretty much get justice, but through different means. So I guess what I'm saying is, in a very crude way, and a kind of poor analogy, what I'm saying is things can be enforced without government and society, and there ends up being rules regardless. So I find that people act like if there's no government and you didn't have this contract that bound people to government, everything would be chaotic. People just be killing each other. And it's like, well, no, because there are consequences beyond what the government does, right? If you were a pharmaceutical company and you put out a product that essentially killed everybody who took it, then nobody is going to trust your company anymore. And you suffer these consequences based on, these people making decisions based on what they know. It's not just the government, penalizing you for putting out a bad product. There are other things that will hurt you without a government existing. And that's why I was really, dissatisfied with Hobbes when I was hearing more about his imagination of a world and why he assumes we would kind of all consent to a social contract. Because he has this very bleak vision that everybody is selfish, so people would act in these ways that are harming each other. But I think because people are selfish, they follow these rules because these rules still have consequences with government or not. So I agree with him that people act in their own self-interest, but I don't agree with him that means everybody would be harming each other and screwing each other over, where we're still playing these long-term repetitive games, right? So I don't think it's a given that we would all consent to a social contract because we need government to hold us all together. I still think we have society without government, so we don't really need to consent directly. So how about you? You jump in a little bit. I kind of ranted there, but I think I was making some sense.
No, you're fine. I followed you just fine. And actually, there are two major points of what you just said that I completely agree with. So the first point, I agree that people in this debate get society and government confused, or rather, they blur the line between society and government. Part of that probably has to do with the fact that we live in the United States, and our founding fathers were trying to create, I guess you could call, a republic of virtue, and a government by, of, and for the people. And back then, there really weren't anarchist tendencies. People kind of just assumed that, well, government is the way it is. So the contract is between the governors and the governed. And then I also agree with you in your criticism of Hobbes's view of the social contract, because, if you read Hobbes, he was obviously a very intelligent guy, and you can follow his argument, and but it's also almost somewhat scary in some sense because he's basically saying, you need to tolerate any form of government. You need to tolerate an autocracy, because the alternative to an autocracy is chaos, and in that chaotic society, as you say, everyone's going to be messing with each other, and being careless, and psychopathic, basically. So we need a king to control everything. So basically, the king would be, I guess, maybe, if to use Freudian terms, he'd kind of be the ego who's trying to control the superego and the id. So that's that's an interesting point of agreement we have. I guess maybe I will go a little into where I think we disagree. So let me say, I guess, a little bit about how I view this concept of the social contract. So I've already said that I think it is between individuals. So when you're in a group of people, or when you're in society, you are acknowledging that, to some degree or another, that is a preferable state to not being in a society. That doesn't mean you necessarily agree with everything that a government is doing, say, or that you agree with everything that your fellow citizens are doing, but you see the living in that society as somehow beneficial, and so you agree to follow certain rules. Now, some of these rules kind of come from governments, and some of them I think are just more maybe innate to human nature. They're more just kind of the way people want to behave. I think most people, don't want to go out and commit murder. I mean, and so some, obviously there's a law against murder, but most people aren't going to go out and commit murder because that's just not the way most people, that's just not the way most people's brains work. So, if you wanted to, say, break this social contract, if you didn't want to agree with the rules, either of the government or just of your society as a whole, I suppose you would just have to go live in a cabin in the woods by yourself and just be completely isolated. Maybe have your friends or family or whoever come with you if you really want to. But point being, I think that would be unnatural. I think it is. I agree with Aristotle. I think it is natural for us to be in a society, and society is a net good, even if government is not in that calculation.
So, okay, so I'll agree with you on the fact that in general, if you live in the middle of the woods, that's going to be unnatural. Not a lot of people want to do that. I would, just for the fun of it, I would note that it is very hard to do that if you did want to abandon society. There are a lot of things keeping you from, like, if you wanted to live in Antarctica, that's really the only ungoverned place. So if you did want to, just get away from everybody, it'd almost be impossible to do it. You'd have to accept some government in some capacity anyways, even if you wanted to do that, which I just think is an interesting thought. And I only mentioned that because you brought it up. Now, I push back against that strongly for, I guess I have one simple problem with what you said, and it's the way you use the word society, because it's just so loose. You're pretty much saying I have to abide by a large set of rules, regulations, and policies pushed down from above because I choose to engage with any single person in this amalgam of all of humanity in a certain jurisdiction. If I want to engage with anybody in really any jurisdiction, I have to take on a ton of regulations and laws. There's really no escaping it unless I want to move to Antarctica, as you're kind of saying. I mean, I apologize if you're catching the fireworks in the background. That's summer in Philadelphia. So what I'm getting at here is I really don't interact with a ton of people in our society, right? I have an employer. I have a group of friends. I have family members, and I talk to you, and we put this on the internet, right? But I'm not interacting with, thousands and thousands of people. Now, to interact with this small group of people just to make a living, and then I go to the store because, I want to go to like a grocery store and I want to be able to get fast food. To interact with select groups of people, you're saying if I want to interact with really any single person that happens to interact with others, I have to take upon these rules. And by interacting with anybody, I've consented to all these rules. I don't see why that should be a requisite. So I feel like I should be able to say associate with my family who happens to live on a piece of property in a state, and it shouldn't follow from that I have to accept that the state bans smoking for people under 21. Like, I don't see how it follows that to associate with any person means I should take on all their rules and I've implied consent to it. One of the common criticisms to the social contract is that for me to opt out of it, you're asking an obscene amount from me. So just to interact with some people, you're asking that, okay, well, if I'm not willing to join that if I'm not willing to take on these regulations, you literally have to move to Antarctica to escape a jurisdiction. And that's like, if I wanted to go to a different country, I would still have to, assume that they had open borders or something and would let me in. So it's not really easy to leave. I'd have to have the financial means. I'd have to have all these things if I wanted to opt out. And it's kind of like asking, there was an example I heard against social contract where imagine you're in a meeting at work and, you're running overtime. So your boss says, okay, well, tomorrow at 3, we'll resume this meeting unless anybody has any objections. So a normal kind of interaction would, if somebody, couldn't make the meeting at 3, is they'd raise their hand. They're like, no, can we reschedule it to 2:30? But you're pretty much saying, well, if you can't do this meeting at 3, then you need to like cut off your arm, right? It's not just that you can't just reschedule it. You're telling me, oh, well, you don't like that this meeting's at 3. It's not just an inconvenience for me to, get out of it or reschedule it or work around it. I need to literally leave behind all of my human relationships and go to Antarctica. That seems a bit unreasonable for something that simply has implied consent. So tell me how you feel about that, because I'm sure you've heard similar, and I'm sure you have thoughts on that.
Okay. I don't think that's quite exactly what I said, so let me maybe clarify my point a bit more. I almost feel like, now we're blurring the line between state and society. I mean, because I'm not saying that you have to agree that, people can't smoke cigarettes until they're 21 to be in a society, to live in society. I'm kind of just thinking out loud here, so take this with a grain of salt. But in some senses, perhaps there's almost a contract between. What I'm trying to say is perhaps there's 2 contracts, and there could be one you have with your government by being in a society, but depending on how you act in certain situations, you agree or disagree with certain parts of that contract. So, if a college student, an 18-year-old college student, goes out and gets drunk every Friday night, they're not, that part of the social contract they're not agreeing with. But I think that part of the social contract is ridiculous, so I don't care. And I don't think that makes them a bad person. I don't think they should get fined or go to jail or whatever for that. But what I'm trying to say is, I think it's this common sense morality that we kind of been talking about before, that we kind of just all live by. That's really what I'm referring to. You don't have to agree with this policy or that policy, and if you don't, then you have to move to Antarctica, and you can never interact with anybody. But I think to have normal human relations, you have to act in a certain way, or your life is going to be far worse off, and everyone else's life is going to be far worse off. If I have certain rules, like when I'm interacting with people, I don't vandalize their property. I don't murder. I don't steal. Those are parts of the social contract that I'm more than happy to are more than happy to abide by, even if I disagree with my government's foreign policy or what have you.
Yeah, I definitely agree that there are like there's a set of norms that we on average follow, and on average it's better that we all follow them. I think okay, so I think I'm fully with you there, 110%. The only time I push back is once we start talking about the enforcement of the government. Now, I guess the reason why that's the reason I keep coming back to that is people typically will point to the social contract and my implied consent just by being alive and not moving to Antarctica. They'll imply that all these government things are okay. So that's why I was quick to bring it to that part. Yeah, but I think you're right on just the basic social level. There's an expectation that I don't, as I'm walking past somebody on the street, that I don't try to assault them in some way, and that would be obscene if I did. Now, I just don't know if it's even necessary to, I guess, have that philosophical, I guess, proposition, because it's almost based on human nature and to define cultural norms. But yeah, I'm definitely okay with ceding that there's a basic level of like decency that we treat each other with on a regular basis, and we've all kind of accepted that those are the rules of the game. And I'm fine with accepting those rules of the games. That's kind of how I guess what I was kind of saying was, even without the government social contract, we inevitably have the social contract you're talking about. That's why
I agree.
Yeah. So like, even if somebody killed my brother, I'm going to go get vengeance if the government doesn't exist, because if nobody's going to enforce it, I'm going to enforce it, right? That's the contract that exists between humans without that force. And I don't even think that's a contract you could opt out of, because that's just saying I accept that human nature is going to exist and people are going to act in a certain way if they need to. So I think so we agree there.
So I guess what I'm trying to say is that really is the best definition of a social contract that I can come up with. Now, people can just say, well, you shouldn't call it the social contract in that case, and that's fine. But that would be my how I think is the best way to defend that concept.
Okay. Now the weakness in that definition is that definition I don't think that can be used to justify government action and then top-down force on individuals. So I don't disagree that's a good way. Like, if you hear the term social contract, I think what you described is an intuitive way of what somebody could think of if they weren't informed by, say, like Hobbes and philosophers. I'd be like, oh yeah, that makes sense. That's a social contract. Now, do you think you can broaden that out to include government? Because that's where I might push back on you. And if you don't, do you think you can defend the government social contract one? And then maybe we can do some back and forth there.
Sure. So, I'm thinking a lot, or when it comes to this topic, I'm thinking a lot about like the worst societies we can think of in human history. So the two obvious ones that everyone can think of off the top of their head: Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. Well, even probably after him. We can all, most people with a brain cell will say those are two awful societies, and I would say that it really in those societies, if I had been in those societies, I would have felt that the social contract had been broken, and I would not feel obliged to live by their rules. So, in Nazi Germany, you were supposed to to be a good law-abiding citizen, you were supposed to turn in Jews. If you saw a Jew, you're supposed to help, turn them in, or, and if you were hiding Jews away in your attic, you could get seriously punished for that. That's an example of government asking you to do something that I consider so atrocious that I would not abide by that. And then, the Soviet Union, I mean, it's a slightly different conversation, but it was just really a psychopath on, high, or having all the power, and, he could kill pretty much anyone who he thought was, disagreed with him, or was going to, wrote something bad about him or something. Again, that's another example of a society in which the social contract had been broken. And I, again, to be clear, I am wanting, or my ideal is a stateless democratic society. So I don't want the state in the long run. In the short run, I guess I would say it really depends on the specific states, on the specific behavior of the state. So I live in the United States of America. I pay my taxes. I don't break any laws. So I am consenting in that sense. Now, that doesn't mean I mean the government does some terrible things. They lock up people, for smoking weed, and I think that's horrible. I've already talked about the horrible stuff they do overseas. So I'm somewhat, you could say I'm somewhat responsible for that. But I have made the calculation that I can do more, and I can thrive and help other people thrive if I consent to this form of government at this time. I guess to add to this, I don't believe in the primacy of private property, but I don't go around, smashing in people's car doors and spray painting their brick houses and whatnot. Even though I don't agree with that aspect of our society. So are you following me there? I mean, are you following my train of thought?
To some extent, I'm following your train of thought. I guess it raises a couple questions. It brought a couple questions to mind for me. So one of the points you're making is you're kind of saying, okay, well, we should imagine the worst societies. Obviously, I would not consent to that because they're literally like telling me that I need to help them round up people and get them murdered. And it's like, okay, yeah, I agree, that's pretty bad. But it seems like a lot of what you're talking about is, at what line do you Matt, as a person, decide that you no longer want to participate? Now, I guess the philosophical debate that I've been more intrigued by, because I'm a self-centered person and it revolves around where I find myself, is I find myself already saying, well, sure, okay, Matt, your line's Hitler. Obviously, I agree that Hitler's worse than what we have right now. But my line is far shorter than even what we have now. So I've already decided, like, okay, I don't consent to this. I'm saying that if some contract exists, I wish to opt out of it, and I'm stating I don't consent to be governed by the United States government. There is no train of course. It's kind of like, are you kind of saying that for me to truly opt out, I need to start breaking more laws? Because you're kind of saying like, well, I don't respect these things the government does, but I'm still abiding by their rules. So to some extent, you're consenting. It's like, well, just because I'm not going out of my way to get myself thrown in a cage, I don't think that means I'm consenting. And one of the things I think is kind of interesting about a lot of the social contract philosophy around it is it uses the word contract, but it doesn't really compare it to any other kind of contract and how we would interpret any real contract in the real world, right? So it doesn't consider that, like, well, if I don't opt into certain government rules, what they're asking of me to say I don't. Essentially, what people are saying is, I consent to it unless I move to Antarctica, right? But if I tell you I don't consent to this contract, right, that's good enough in any other situation. So it's kind of like, what is asked of me if I've already decided that our government's gone too far? Do you think me explicitly stating it is good enough to opt out? And it's like, to me, it seems like there is no way to opt out. I shouldn't even think like that because it's obviously impossible in our society. But is that right? I guess. And I do think everything you said about wanting a stateless democracy is interesting, and I think we should definitely talk about that further. But I kind of want to address. Maybe I want to see if you have any thoughts on what I just said before we try to confront that line of thinking.
Okay, so well, just to put one puzzle piece down. I mean, I think again, you know, I don't believe in every law that the state passes. I don't believe. I mean, we've been using smoking. They raised the smoking age to 21. I think that's stupid. I don't agree with that. Now, I'm not out there campaigning for its repeal, but I think it's a stupid law, and I don't care if an 18, 19, 20-year-old is smoking cigarettes. So, you know, you can consent to. I guess this is what I would say. You can consent to a society in general, or even a government in general, even if you radically disagree with certain policies and with certain laws and pieces of legislation. And I would say that I would say that both you and I are consenting in the sense that we do pay our taxes and we do. I mean, we don't have to be, you know, legislators. We don't have to be politicians to participate in our society somewhat. Now you say you don't go out very much. I don't either. But I'm still a part of the United States of America. I'm one of its citizens, and I still contribute to, you know, in little ways at least, I'm contributing to that society, you know, in my behavior and if I'm, you know, earning money and whatnot. So I guess that would be my distinction if you follow me.
Yeah, okay. So one thing I would say is for me personally, like I know we use smoking as an example, and I use that because it's an overwhelmingly popular thing to kind of say it's stupid that you should have to be 21 to buy cigarettes now. But I would say that there's it would be tough for me to defend really any part of government function in our country. Like I don't think I could defend any of it. So it's not just that there are like some things that jump out to me as like, okay, well, I don't like this thing, but you know, as a whole, I'm glad I'm willing to, you know, exist here. But so I oppose everything the government does. Because even the things that you would argue are popular and like, well, what, Matt, you don't want police around. It's like, well, police are crowding out the private sector that would take them, that would fill their role if the police didn't exist. So the only arguments that are almost defensible, I think they're crowding out the private solutions. So I wouldn't defend any of it. Now, it sounds like you're saying that like, okay, well, by taxes, I'm kind of complicit in the system. I'm implying my consent. Well, the reason I pay taxes is one is because my employer and almost any mainstream employer in the United States will opt me into taxes, and you can't just tell them to not withhold anything. You actually have to. And if I push back on my employer, I don't think my employer would be comfortable hiring me because I'd be a legal liability to them, and I don't provide that much surplus. So it's kind of like to be employed at all, I have to be opted into this withholding. And once they withhold it, they're not going to give it back to me unless I have like an incredible financial situation. So pretty much I either have to be employed or I have to, I either have to give up my job, right, and any kind of formal employment, or I'd have to, I don't know, find a way to steal my money back from them, in which case they would likely hunt me down, take me from my family, and lock me up for decades, right? So I don't think it's a reasonable expectation to say, well, Matt, if you don't consent to this system, the way you have to signal that you don't consent to it is by doing something that will almost certainly ruin your life in every capacity. And it's like, well, I want to consent on the personal level to society. Sure, if society means my friends, my family, my stores, any kind of economic interaction I have, my interaction with my employer, of course I want to consent with them. That's great. But it's like, but I need to push back on this part I need to make it very clear that I'm in no way standing for, and I want to get away from this system we have. And I don't care. I don't want to do it through their system. I don't trust it. I don't want to work with it. It's inefficient, and I don't think I should even need to. So you're saying the only way for that to be, I guess, valid is for me to do something that is dangerous to myself. Now, I guess I'm less picking on you and more picking on the whole argument of the social contract that Hobbes kind of makes. Because Hobbes is kind of saying, well, yeah, unless I do that, you really are consenting, Matt, because you exist here. And the only option I see is like doing something incredibly radical or moving to Antarctica as like a real way to actually opt out. That's why I think the social contract is something people they latch onto it because it seems to justify use of force. But the expectations of opting out of it are so unreasonable that I just can't imagine people genuinely believing it other than a post hoc rationalization. And that's really what I've kind of, as I'm listening to things, that's how I'm feeling. But yeah, I just want to reiterate everything about, random people that I'm engaging with and citizens. I'm okay with that part of the social contract. But if there's two social contracts and one with government, I want out of the second one. So that's what I'm saying. So I'm putting you in what I think is a unimaginable position of trying to defend that. And that's why I'm not expecting you to like blow me away, because I don't think it's a defendable position. Yeah. So I'm yeah. Do it that way you will. I'm sorry for once again ranting. It kind of just happens.
That argument, this is slightly off topic, but I'm reminded your argument just now reminds me of the exact same argument that some people, some socialists or communists make against capitalism, in the sense that, well, you have to get a job, you have to sell yourself for wages or you die. So what kind of freedom is that? It seems like an interesting little other side of the coin, from what you're saying.
But wait, I don't want to lose that thought though. The reason why I think I'm valid and they're not though is because I'm pretty much saying everything I want will still exist without government, right? I don't need to engage with the government to work with my employer or to work with my friends. The government has nothing to do with that, and if they didn't exist, I could still have those associations. Now socialists are saying I have to work to get money to buy things I want. It's like, well, yeah, but if you didn't have a government, socialists could still, if you can end up obtaining a plot of land in any way, you can live off that without engaging with other markets, like you could, hypothetically. So it's like you would have to do a little bit of capitalist buy-in, but you could be self-sufficient away from markets. I can't get away from government no matter where I go. Like, period.
You don't have to do capitalist buy-in.
Well, I mean, if you wanted to be a practical, I guess, socialist, I would think the idea would be to buy into the system enough to obtain property and then opt out, right? You're like, I have the property, I'm going to self-sustain. Now, my problem is I still like society, right? So what I'm not asking those socialists to give up engaging with society, but I'm pretty much saying if you don't like capitalism, then why are you engaging in markets, right? That's the thing you're pushing back against. I still want to engage with markets. I don't want to engage with government, and governments aren't a requisite of markets. But socialists push back on, I guess, money and people not being given things that are created in a certain equitable way. I don't know if you're understanding my distinction, or if I maybe need to try to spell it out better.
I guess what I would say is, oh yeah, you did put me in a difficult position, and I appreciate that. It keeps me thinking on my toes. So, I mean, I do think Okay, I need to think about this for a second. When I think about, well, I mean, let's just take the example that I was using earlier. So I don't believe in private property or the primacy of private property. I don't believe that, I don't believe that, the idea of owning a plot of land really makes sense philosophically. And I think, economically, there's also problems with that. But I don't go and destroy people's property. I'm not, there are environmentalists, for example. I consider myself an environmentalist of sorts. They're environmentalists who, destroy construction workers' equipment and blow up dams. I'm not doing that. So, the question is, am I buying into this capitalist system by not doing those things? So, am I, in some sense, am I leading a double life in that, I don't really consent to this capitalist system, but I am taking part in this capitalist system? And I'm bringing this up because I think it's somewhat analogous to what you're talking about. And I suppose I would have to say that, yes, I am participating in a capitalist system, even if I don't agree with capitalism at the end of the day. And it's kind of the same with you. You don't like the state. You're not you don't approve of what the state does. You don't even approve of the state's existence, but you are paying taxes, and you're not breaking, laws. You're not stealing. You're not murdering, etc. So in some sense, it's just almost a pragmatic point. I mean, you and I are doing what we can to make sure our life isn't awful, or that the government or capitalism doesn't make our life awful. So I don't. I guess that's my piece said.
So I actually like that example. It raises another point that I think I wanted to kind of include in, and I think it makes some things I'm trying to say make more sense. So I agree with everything you said, because we actually talked about this a couple weeks ago. I don't know if it was last week, but I pretty much said, yeah, I feel bad when I pay taxes. I feel like I'm letting gangsters shake me down, and I feel like I'm letting those gangsters use that money to rob more people and to harm more people, and it makes me feel terrible. But I think it's really messed up. That is why I hate the social contract idea in terms of with the government, because I think it's messed up that then they say, so you're consenting. And I'm like, well, no, I don't consent. They're shaking me down. They're robbing me. I'm saying, I hate this. I hate this. I'm screaming it. And then it's like, yeah, but philosophically, you consented to be shaken down. And it's like, well, no, here's the thing. I'm not throwing my life away to fight you, but that's not consent. That's the furthest thing from consent, right? It's like if somebody mugged me and they had a gun and they said, give me your wallet. And it's like, I know, okay. So it's like, okay, well, I either say, I'm not giving you my wallet and they shoot me dead, or I give them my wallet and then I've consented to giving them my wallet, because if I didn't give them my wallet, they ruin my life. That's what the government does. If I don't pay my taxes, Matt, the government comes and they take me and they throw me in a cage. That's exactly what happens. If I don't give up my job, then my taxes go to the government, or I have to get a job off the grid and hide my taxes. And then if they find out, they take me and they lock me in a cage for 20 years. That's what you're saying. So like the fact that I'm not willing to do that does not mean consent in any way. It's like calling it consent seems so obscene to me. Hold on. You got me fired up, and and you know what? I'm fired up because I'm justified for being fired up, because everything I said made sense. So push back on that. Do it, please.
Alrighty. I guess I'll take the kid gloves off then. Look, you are. If you're consenting, you're consenting only to go along to get along. That is pretty much what everyone does when they're in a society. Again, that doesn't mean you agree with everything the government does. And I should. Well, I'll speak for myself. In terms of what the government does, in terms of locking people up for victimless crimes, in terms of promoting chaos in the Middle East and elsewhere, just for geopolitical reasons, I should probably be doing more to fight that stuff. And I am in some sense culpable I am in some sense guilty for the bad things that my government does. But I am. Here's the thing, and this I heard that Tom Woods example about the mugger. Well, you're consenting to give him your wallet if he mugs you. I mean, that I think that's such a terrible metaphor, because the government is not simply stealing your money and running the other way. Now and this goes back, of course, taxation is. You think taxation is theft, and I don't, but The government at its worst, does some things for its citizens. That doesn't mean that I want government to exist in the long run, and that doesn't mean I support the government that we have in place. But I'll say one more thing, and that is this. And I think you'll radically disagree with this. The the United States of America is probably the freest country on earth. And they have taxes, they violate the non-aggression principle and so on and so on. That is the freest state in the world. And part of that has to do with the way our founders set up the Constitution. Part of that just has to do with popular activism over the years. But there's probably fewer places I would want to live. There are so many places I would not want to live. And instead of the United States, I would much prefer living in the United States for the fact that it is one of the freest countries on earth. You can say it's lower, very low on the authoritarian end in some ways, at least domestically speaking. And so, in that sense, anyone who lives here is consenting.
Okay. Okay. So okay, I'm going to go back to the taxation as theft part, and then and then later I'll address the your Ben Shapiro style of arguing right there. Because saying, okay, Matt, it's not free, but it's better than other countries. It's like, dude, when did this radical leftist anarchist literally quote Boomer Khan Ben Shapiro? That's literally what you just did, and I'm okay with that. I agree with that point. It's like, yeah, I'd rather live in America, but that doesn't mean it's better than. It doesn't mean I have to consent to government. It's like if no government, it's almost proving my point of what you're saying. Is you're saying, okay, Matt, well, pick a worse government or move to Antarctica then, because those are my only choices, right? And I'm saying, well, I'm not satisfied with any of them because I don't want to be governed. But you're pretty much saying, well, go live in the worst, more unfree places then, Matt. It's like that's clearly a non-option. But we won't get into that part. Let's address the taxation as theft part. The government spends our money so inefficiently on such disgusting ways too that it's like if a mugger said, "Okay, I'm going to take $200 from you, and I'm going to put $3 of this into maintaining your roads, and I'm going to give $1 to a subsidy of your local store, and then I'm going to spend this much money on old people. I'm going to spend $70 on old people, $70 on killing people in the Middle East, and $40 on some other bureaucratic waste." In government pensions and paying down our debt. It's like, okay, congrats. You stole $200 from me because I didn't want to give it to you. You spent $3 of it back on me and I didn't ask for it. And then you wasted the other 197. It's like, I don't know how you're finagling that into me consenting. I mean, if you use the phrase going along to getting along, and I think that lines up perfectly with the mugger example. I give the mugger my wallet instead of getting killed because I'm going along to getting along. But that didn't mean I consent to it. It's like, yeah, I'm playing it out game theoretically, because if I don't play it game theoretically, something really bad happens to me. It's obviously the most simple choice. But it doesn't really mean I consented it, because it's like if somebody said, okay, Matt, you're going to sign this contract with me. You're going to work at my company for $8 an hour till you're 65, and then I'll give you $300 a month. And you're like, well, that's terrible. I'm a smart kid. I can do great things. And it's like, well, guess what, Matt? If you don't sign this, I'm going to shoot you in the head. I have a gun to your head. And it's like, oh, well, in any civil society with any reasonable expectations of a contract, if you say, okay, well, you had a choice, right? You could either get shot or put in a cage, or even I'll even give you the much nicer option, because getting shot hurts, but maybe you can move to Antarctica instead. I think that's reasonable. Here, you have those three options, or you can sign this contract that's terrible. It's like, well, nobody would call it consenting to the contract because you picked it and it was the least worst option. So I guess I don't have a problem with you saying, well, Matt, why don't you leave America? It's like, well, that's not really my point. We're talking about the social contract as a theory, and the social contract says you're in this bad situation where you're going to go along to get along if you don't like it. And guess what? I'm going to call that consent because I'm a person who's playing language games. And I'm going to defile the word consent and put it in such grotesque terms that something that loosely, that doesn't even characterize your support in any capacity is now consent. It's like if you want to defile the word to that level, then the word is meaningless. That's the point I'm trying to make. I very much, yeah, you drew that out of me, and I'm happy you did, because that felt good to say, but that's 110% how I'm feeling on that. But yeah, the Boomer Khan stuff, just to put a bow on it though, I agree with you. I don't want to live in Europe. I don't want to live in the Middle East. I don't want to live in Africa. I'm not 100% sold on that. But the problem is, when I've looked at moving to foreign countries, the issue is then you have to work with their immigration systems to get there. So I'd actually consider leaving the United States if I didn't have to do all this work to be a second-rate citizen in a different status society. But unfortunately, the state is ever present, and it's doing evil, and it's telling me that I'm consenting because I'm not blowing up buildings or moving to Antarctica. So yeah, that's my piece on that. I think after that rant, you can say what you'd like, and I probably not only put myself on 3 watch lists there, but I've also probably burned out all my mental integrity on this topic, and I don't want to accidentally say anything that might be misconstrued as bad taste. So I think I'll give you the last word because you deserve it, because you listened to me yell. You earned it. That's your true pay. You get the last word. And then maybe we'll wrap around on the other topic, unless there's any other element of the discussion you want to touch on. I'll try not to yell anymore. Thank you.
Okay. I guess I'll just talk a little bit about this taxation is theft thing, and then we can probably move on. And I think I've said this before, but my ideal, when there is such a thing as government, if governments are to exist, I mean, there needs to be major accountability. So, the idea, and you can say the U.S. government or our founding fathers failed in their attempt to create a government of, for, and by the people. But in some sense, that's how I view government. I mean, it originated with people. You could say it originated with the richest among us, the most powerful among us. So in that sense, in some sense, it's only a responsive to a subset of the population. But the way I view taxes, I mean, I don't even think, in some sense, you don't even need a government to have taxes. And taxes are, I view taxes as the money that all of us have, in some sense, collectively. And we've all decided that this amount of money is going to go to building roads or having an education system, and all this stuff that we consider to be first world, or that all these stuff that the first world has and other places are trying to get. So that's why I don't think taxation is theft, because in some sense, I don't even view it as the government's money. I view it as our money, which is why I feel somewhat responsible, or not somewhat responsible, which is why I feel responsible when the government does something awful, like locking up people for smoking weed. Probably at some point in my life, some of my tax money will go to that. That's awful. I've consented to that, and I need to do what I can to offset that fact.
Well, I did promise you the last word on that topic, so I'm not going to respond to the more what I find what's the word for it? Provocative parts of what you said there. But they're only provocative to me because if you use the word collective and imply that my money is in a collective pot, I get triggered. But I'm also easily triggered. And it does make me think that, as we did like the kind of In Defense of anarcho-capitalism episode, I almost think like we should do a more broad episode on maybe collectivism and individualism, because I feel like that's something we might want to define down and think about. Because I just think it's interesting, and I think it's one of those premises that isn't explored as much, right? It's just some people are like, I'm an individualist. Some people are like, I don't know. I think this is kind of a pot of everybody's money. And I'm just kind of like, why is that just like okay that we both have such rapidly different priors? Like, should we investigate that better, maybe? So that could be some food for thought. Now, one thing this is to go left field, and it kind of ties back into the socialism versus capitalism debate we talked about. Is you mentioned government accountability. And I just have I had a really interesting thought. I don't know if it's one of those things that I'm taking credit for because I read it somewhere and I forgot. Like maybe Rothbard talked about this a little bit. But it's one of those things, or it could have been Mises. But since government is ideally accountable, that's one of those things that inevitably makes government inefficient. Because in some ways, the private sector has to be accountable to like shareholders. But not every company has shareholders, and not every company has a owner that specifically wants everything to show how it relates to profit. So when you have a government system, bureaucracy is almost inevitable. And this is one of the things that I found curious about, and I'm taking this very left field. We're no longer talking about the social contract. We have packed that and shipped that out. Andrew Yang, he ran on universal basic income. And part of what he was saying with universal basic income is we have all these overly regulated bureaucratic we have these bureaucratic, the word handout is derogatory, but I'm just struggling to think of a better word right now. So just don't read into my connotation too much. But he's like, we have all these different handouts, right? And they have all these strict parameters, and they all have to be managed and regulated in this very specific way. And he pretty much said, we're going to get rid of them for the most part. UBI for everyone. And then if you were getting more than that, we'll figure that out and you'll keep getting your more money. So I'm part of this, like, I'm kind of sympathetic to it, right? Because I understand it's like, okay, well, you're going to make the whole system more efficient. If we're going to be giving people money, at least you're doing it in this more standardized way, so you don't have to worry about all these weird payment cliffs. But it's not means tested anymore. I make more money than probably a lot of people who live around me because I stayed in my college neighborhood, and most people around me don't have a lot of money, and that's just kind of how it is. So like I would not be eligible for the benefits that a lot of people around me are, and then all of a sudden a lot of us would be getting the same benefits, and some people could see that as wrong. So I'm curious because you mentioned accountability. I don't know if you've thought about it a lot. I know this because super out of left field, but have you thought about things like how UBI relates to that and how there's like, on some hands we want to only help people who really need it, but on the other hand it's like that inevitably leads to bureaucracy. But if we standardize it, then we kind of have to universalize things. I don't know. You have any thoughts on that? Because I just find it an intriguing kind of part to think about when we talk about big government programs. And when I take out my priors of like, well, I hate it no matter what, it's like, okay, well, Matt, let's do some sophisticated thinking. And I think it's kind of an intriguing concept to grapple with. Go ahead.
Okay, so I might have said this before, but in some ways I often feel like I'm fighting on two fronts. So, you know, there's my ideal society that I want, you know, the stateless democratic society where people have, you know, a good amount of freedom to interact and you know, they're not forced to, they're not chained to, you know, this to earning money just to survive and all this stuff, you know, blah, 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 blah. And then there's the practical side of things, which, as you know, I'm more than willing to use government intervention or government programs in order to improve people's lives. You know, because I do believe that that we need to make we need to try, if someone truly cares about the working class, and I know that's a big term, but you know, if we really care about working class people, then I think we have to get into the nitty gritty and you know, play politics and do things we can to better their lives before or until, you know, we can get to a point where we don't need, where we can kind of move past the nation state as such. And so I'm reminded of, I know I always bring it up and I feel like a ridiculous fanboy for doing this, but Slavoj Žižek, in one of the lectures he gives, I feel like I bring him up every episode, but in one of the lectures he gives, he made an interesting statement. He said the problem with the Soviet Union was it wasn't bureaucratic enough. Now that's a strange thing. Obviously, people, you know, if you read Trotsky and his criticisms of the you know, what he called the degenerated workers' state, he said it was bureaucracy, and the problems involved in the Soviet Union were there was too much bureaucracy, and what needed to happen was a less bureaucratic form of Soviet democracy, and then, you know, it would have led to the workers' paradise, and et cetera, et cetera. But I guess the way I interpret what Zizek is saying there is, and I this kind of goes back to the last debate. We need we need a society in which we allow people to not have to you know, tune into politics all the time. People should be able to have time to, you know, open a beer and watch up Keeping Up with the Kardashians or whatever the heck cool kids do today. You know, you can't, it doesn't make sense to be in a society where, well, you know, every day after work, we got to go to town hall and I got to talk about with 50 other people on, you know, how are we going to fund healthcare? And then, you know, I got to have a, you know, mandatory military day to defend my country. You know, that's just not a society that a lot of people want to live in. So my view of this stateless democracy, it does allow people The system or the lack of system, whatever's in place, or whatever you want to term that kind of society, it would work in such a way as to you don't have to, while you're given permission to, while you're given the opportunity to thrive and to have your say, you don't have to spend every night debating politics. You don't have to spend every night, I don't know, being a janitor. You can. I want a society in which everybody has time for leisure and for whatever they want to do. Start a podcast, write a book, form a band. And so the problem with our current society and with our government and the bureaucracy that comes along with it, it doesn't allow for that. In some sense, you almost have to be too tuned in to that society in order to get things done, and that's what I disagree with it about.
I actually have like a whole can of worms of like actual maybe interesting points to make on that thought. I don't know if we want to go into that right now or not.
How much time do we have?
Well, it's already we've just ticked over an hour. Do you have more availability after this?
I'm free.
Maybe this could be an impromptu double episode. Does that sound interesting? I'm not doing anything because I have a lot of things to build off that. So maybe I can make my last point specifically on the Zizek comment, and then we could rope back around to maybe a stateless democracy and maybe try to do like a quick. Well, I actually don't want to do it quick. I just want to do a separate episode. So we'll leave that in because us just having that live conversation on air is now a teaser for the next episode 23. So you better tune in. Now, the last thought I guess I'll have before we wrap this one up and then jump onto that one is I poorly drew. It's going to turn up so bad. Okay, you can see it's a little graph, right? Okay, so on the y-axis, imagine how blunt of a government program it is, right? So like UBI as opposed to food stamps, right? UBI applies to everybody. And then on the on the x-axis, imagine how like efficient it is in terms of inputs in to payouts, right? So if we spent $1,500 on that program, if it actually paid like close to $1,500, it'd be like way over on the x-axis. So I have a theory that Yang, his policies are somewhere up here, right? So because they are so blunt of tools, the inputs being like $1,500 pay out closer to $1,500 because everybody gets it. You don't have to manage it. Now, but what you're talking about Zizek with like this very more managed, I think it ends up being down here. Because what ends up happening is I can imagine a world where you tell me, okay, Matt, I'll be reasonable here. I'll be reasonable. You're like, okay, this dude, he's got $100 billion. Maybe if we take 1 billion of that, he won't miss 1 billion of it, and 1 billion can feed a ton of people in Africa. And even I would probably see like, okay, that's a better allocation of resources. So if you find these very narrow ways to take from the very, very, very top and then put it to the very, very bottom, you end up with like these very focused policies, which I can imagine Zizek being like, yeah, if you have these very narrow policies, you can clearly see the gains to people. The problem is the manpower that goes into those inputs. You have to have a bunch of people figuring out, okay, well, how are we going to get the money from this person? How do we identify this very small group? How do we go about setting up boundaries? How do we go about who deserves it? Then you have all these extra bureaucratic costs. But then you can imagine, but since you're helping the people at the absolute lowest and taking it from the people at the absolute top, well, now we're benefiting society the most, even though there's a bunch of loss there. That's kind of what I was getting at. All the stuff about the stateless democracy I liked, but to close this loop, I just wanted to get that out there. So if you're okay with that, I'm going to sign off. And okay, so I hope everybody enjoyed that passionate debate about the social contract, which even though I got angry about 40 minutes in, we still we are good enough at doing this and maintaining our composure to actually sequence into another probably close to hour-long conversation. So everybody, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and tune in for the next one. Thank you.